Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Now today I've not finished this. Before you say that's not a very big blanket, I've not finished it. I've still got some work to do on it. Now I'm going to show you how to make this. Now I've put a couple of pictures up. Now that's a couple of pictures of this blanket on the floor, and it shows what I mean when you use your granny squares. This is made up, I've used 7 granny squares to make this blanket, and then I've done a zigzag granny stitch crochet across the top of all these squares, and then I stitched the squares together. The reason, when you watch the video, the reason I did the first row first and then I stitched my corners, because if you stitch your corners of your granny squares into a line, you don't want to have a big space here. So what I did was I did my first zigzag row and then a stitch. I think I've done either 1 or 2 of the rows, and then I stitched the corners of my granny squares together so that I didn't have a big hole or gap here. And this is how it's turned out. I've used sort of autumny colours. You can use scrap yarn for this. You can use all your odd balls. Just do your repetitions. You can make it all one colour. It's up to you. Now it does, when you see it, as in those pictures, it ends up a little bit where it looks like you've got stacks and stacks of granny squares all just sitting on top of each other. You can see that dimension in it, and you can see it here. It just actually looks like you've got lots of stacks of granny squares. It turns out beautiful. You can make your squares any size you want. Make them any size that you want. I did 5 rounds. I'll show you how I did my squares. The one thing about the squares is, what sets this blanket off is doing white around, or a light colour, whatever colours you choose to make yours. If you do that last row on your granny squares a light colour, it really helps to make that sort of 3D effect pop out, and you can see that it looks as if it's kind of popping out, and it really does look as if that blanket's going in and then up like that in a stack. And it's because I've got these light colours in. What also helps that 3D effect is some dark stripes. If you put some dark stripes in every now and then, that also helps that 3D effect show when your blanket's either over the back of your sofa or on your bed. Or this is make a beautiful gift. Now you don't need I used all the sort of darker sort of colours that I had, I just had in my scrap box where I've got all my scrap 1 balls of yarn. And if you've got, let's say you've got like 6 scrap balls of yarn, you can make this, and this will be quite big, because 6 balls of yarn is quite a lot, and it'll make quite a big blanket. Now what to do is, I've done 7 granny squares. I've done 7. I'll get my measuring tape. Now I need to give it a little spray and then flatten it down to let it dry. If you make it a little bit damp on the pieces that are curling, if you make it a little bit damp and then just flatten it all down on a dry towel, a dry bath sheet, and put it down, and put another bath sheet or so on the top, that'll take the curl out of your yarn. Now I'll get my measuring tape out my little drawer here, and I'll tell you how in inches and in centimetres how long mine's came out. Now I used Aran yarn. In the UK this is Aran yarn, so if you're in the USA or one of the other countries that works with the sort of the weight size, Aran is a weight 5 a 4, a weight 4. So Aran yarn is a weight 4. So you can use any yarn you want for this. You can use 4-ply, which is really thin. You can use double knitting, which is a weight 3. You can use Aran. You can use chunky. You can use any yarn that you want. Now this came out, I would say 45 inches. It's came out at 45 inches. And that is like 115 centimetres. It's 115 centimetres wide. Now I've not finished. I've still got some more yarn. I'm still going to make this like bigger. A beautiful blanket. You could do it in all different colours. It's up to you what colours you use. You can use any yarn, any weight yarn. Just use the hook size it tells you on the label of the yarn that you're going to use. Now for this, I used a UK 6mm hook. I used a 6mm hook, and I've just used all different kinds. It's not all the same brand of yarn either. As long as it's all the same thickness, then you can use up all your scraps of yarn. And I kind of got the colouring, not too bad, and I like it. I love the way when you're looking down on it that it goes into that 3D effect, and you can see these peaks and valleys on it. Now because I've not finished my blanket, I've not done my edge. Now I think what I would do with my edge, I would use a UK double crochet. That's a single crochet in the USA, and I would maybe just put 2 stitches into each row. Each row I would put 2 in and work all the way up. I was going to do that in the white, but I've not finished my blanket yet. So once I've finished my blanket, I'm going to put UK double crochets, that's single crochets in the USA, 2 into each row, all the way up the sides. And then what I'll do is, I'll do 1 row of white in my granny stitch on these peaks along the top when I'm finished the blanket, and then down this side again I would use a USA single crochet, that's a UK double crochet, 2 into each row, 2 stitches into each row all the way just down the sides in my white. And that's really going to set this whole blanket off, having that border of white all the way around it. So that's the way you'll finish it if you want to finish it like that. So I started it off with the crescendo Aran yarn that King Cole did. Some of the other ones are not King Cole, but there is Aran yarn. Some of it's Stylecraft, some of it's Paint Box. So it's just a little mix of all these odd balls that I've had. So up here, down here I did 1 row of each, then I did 2 rows of each colour, keeping it all the same. Then I went back to doing 1 row of each colour. I should have actually started, I've did that one with the blue. So that one I should have actually started with the blue. I think it's just because I added that colour in, just as an afterthought. I found that ball and I put that ball of yarn in. So I've done 1 row of each, and then once I get back to this blue, once I've done all my colouring, so from here I'm going to do another 2 rows of each colour. Then I'll go back to 1 row of each colour, then 2 rows until I've got no yarn left. And then I'll just edge it in white, like I've just said to you. So there won't be a video of, oh, this is my blanket finished, because it's going to take me another week or so to finish this. I might pop up on the community page, I'll put a couple of pictures up of it finished, but I'm thinking that I'm going to do this in between my other videos, and I'm going to make this really long so that it could just be a blanket that will go over the top of my sofa. I've got a 3-seater sofa, and that I want that so that I can just put that over it, and if it gets chilly, because we had snow yesterday, we actually had nearly 3 inches of snow, and I want a blanket that I can just, that's traditional with this traditional granny stitch, that I could just take off my sofa and put over my knees, or wrap myself up in it if I'm getting a little bit chilly with the winter coming in. So I'm going to show you how I did this, how I did the squares, and then how I started the zigzag, and where I kept the corners so that we still had that zigzag. When we do the zigzag, that you still had that peak and that down into that valley, down into that V down here, and it keeps it as a zigzag blanket. It's beautiful, and I'm going to show you how to make it. So what I did slightly different, my fifth row I put some white around. I've also got these squares done as well. I done these ones in different colours and I finished it on white. If you make your last round a really light colour, it's going to help your squares stand out. We're going to start with a magic circle. Put the end of the yarn down your hand and just wrap it around your hand and then cross it over. Put your hook under that one and pull this one through like this. You've made, it's like a large slip knot. Now for in the middle, I'm going to chain 3, so we'll count that as our first stitch. So we're going to do 3. 1, chain 3, 1, 2, and 3. Now in the middle of mine, I've got 4 stitches. I've got 4 sets of 4. You can do 3 if you want to do 3. You don't need to do 4, but I've done in the middle 4. So that's what we're going to do. So that's stitch 1. We're going to do UK treble crochets. These are USA double crochets if you're in the USA. So that's stitch 1. So in to my loop, we'll do one more, that's the second one. Yarn over and through the loop and pull through. You've got 3 loops on your hook. So yarn over, through 2 loops, and yarn over and through 2 loops. So we've got 1, 2, 3 stitches. We'll do one more. We're going to chain 2, 1 and 2. So we're going to make our first corner. So back into the loop, put 4 more stitches. So yarn over and into the same big loop, we're going to put 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've got one corner made. Chain 2, 1, 2. Put 4 more in. 4 more stitches into that loop. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Chain 2, 1, 2. So you're going to need 4 sets of 4 and you should have 4 chains. Pull my loop a little bit, we don't need it quite as big. So we've done our chain 2, put 4 more stitches in. Make your next group. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Chain 2, 1, 2. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and that's our 4th one. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull that loop tight. Pull it in. And we're going to close the round off. Find the top of that chain of 3. You've got 1, 2, and 3 stitches. Now pull through and slip. Now you've got your square done. So you can pull that in. You can stitch in your tail end. I'm going to do the next round. So this is round 2. We're going to chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. Now into that space, we're going to put 1 stitch. We're going to build the granny stitches now, and your granny stitches are made up of 3 sets, 3 stitches in each set. Now I've already got 2 here. I'm going to leave that. I'll put the last one in when I come all the way around. I'll close the round with the last stitch, and that way I'll have the corner to work into again. So we've got the chain of 3 and 1 stitch in that space. We're going to chain 1, just 1, only in this round. We're going to chain 1 to take us to this corner. In here you're going to put 3 stitches, put a granny cluster in, so that's 3 stitches, 1, 2 and 3. Now you can grab your yarn and work along with the video. Now this is a corner, so we're going to chain 2, 1, 2, and we're going to put another 3 stitches. Do your granny cluster in there again, that's 3 stitches. If you're in the UK, these are treble crochets. If you're in the USA, it's double crochets. The same stitch, we just call it something different. So that's 1 into that corner space, 2, and your 3rd stitch to complete your granny cluster. Chain 1 to take us to this corner. Now it's only this round we'll be chaining 1 in between the clusters to take us over those 4 stitches. So in to the next corner, 1 cluster, 2 chain and 1 cluster. So 1, 2 and 3 stitches. That's the granny cluster done. So chain 2, because we're in the corner. Now into the corner again, do your next granny cluster, 1, 2 and 3. Chain 1 and move to the next corner. Put 1 cluster in, 1, 2, that's 3 stitches for each cluster. Now chain 2, 1, 2. Now in there again, put another cluster. And if I'm going too fast for beginners, you can pause the video and catch up. Now chain 1, but only this round, remember. Now we're back almost where we started. We're in this last corner. So I'm going to put 1 cluster in. So that's 3 stitches. 1 into that last corner. 2. Don't worry about it going like that. It will straighten itself out. And that will tighten up and you can sew that tail in. So 1 more is 3. Going to chain 2, 1, 2, and you're going to put 1 more stitch, and then we're going to close the round. So put 1 more stitch and slip stitch to the top of that chain of 3 that you started with. Now what we're going to do is we're going to slip stitch across, so go through that stitch, pull your yarn through and slip your stitch and slip into that space. It's a lot easier just to slip into the spaces that are the closest. And that's your next round done. So that's round 2 done. Now we're going to do round 3. We're not going to chain in between the granny clusters. We're only going to do 2 chains in the corner. So the only time you chain now is in here. I found personally, if you chain 1 in between your clusters when you wash your project, these granny squares can get a little bit big and a little bit out of shape. Now we put the chain 1 in because we've got 4 stitches here. If you do this centerpiece just with 3 stitches, don't do the chain 1. Just go straight over to your corners. So we're going to do a chain, that's the first stitch, 1, 2 and 3. Now put 2 more in there, 1 and 2. That's your first cluster made of round 3. Now go to the corner, 1 cluster, 2 chain and 1 cluster in the corner. So that's 1 cluster done. chain 2 because we're in the corner, and do one more cluster. Now you can use any yarn you want for this. You can use double knitting, you don't need to use a weight 4 or Aran yarn. You can use any yarn. Now straight over to that space and put a cluster in there, your granny stitch in there. Don't do any chains, just go straight in. And that's going to help your granny square stay square for a lot longer, a lot more washes. Now into the corner again, build your corner, 1 cluster, 2 chain and 1 cluster. And your granny cluster has 3 stitches. So chain 2 and do another cluster in that corner. 2 and 3. Now go straight over to this space here and put 1 cluster in. 1, 2 and 3 stitches. Don't worry about it curling, it'll straighten itself out. Into the corner and build your next corner. 1 cluster, 2 chain and 1 cluster. So do the 2 chain, 1 and 2, and build your next cluster. And you're going to do 5 rounds like this. So you've got your centre one, that's round 1, that one is round 2, and this one is round 3. Now straight over to the space, no chains, just go in to the middle space. Now in to the corner. So I've done my last corner and I'm going to slip stitch to that first cluster that I did. So that's 4 rounds done. Now you can leave it at this size if you want, and your zigzag is going to have smaller granny squares, but I've done mine's this size. I've put 5 rounds on mine. So what I did slightly different from the squares I've just showed you how to make, my 5th row I put some white around. I've also got these squares done as well. I done these ones in different colours and I finished it on white. If you make your last round a really light colour, it's going to help your squares stand out against the zigzags that are going to go up here. I'm going to pop these aside just now and I'm going to show you how to join these and do the zigzags. Now, when I was experimenting with this, I stitched here. I stitched them all together here at the corners, turned like this. But when I did my granny square here and skipped over, I was left with quite a big space here. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go from here over to here and leave this open. And once we've done 1 or 2 rows, we can come back and stitch down. We can stitch this space down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop them off to the side. I'll just pop them up there. I need 2, so I'm going to keep 1 here. Now I'm going to start with different colours. You can do each row different colours, or you can do 2 rows of the same colour. You can do this in these squares and do all the same colour. It's up to you. Your imagination is boundless, so it's up to you what you decide to do. So I've got my yarn, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in to the stitch, the first stitch in that corner chain. Pull my yarn through. You can use any yarn you want for this. Now I've been using an Aran yarn. That's a weight 4 if you're in the USA, but you can use any yarn. I'm going to chain 2, 1, 2, and into the same stitch I'm going to put 1 UK treble crochet. That's a double crochet if you're in the USA. Now, and leave that there. We're going to go over to the first space. Now that is not going to count as a stitch. That's not a stitch. So we're going to put a cluster of 3 in here. 1, 2, and 3. Move to the next cluster, work your way up. We should end up, once we get to this top peak, we should end up with 5 clusters. We should always just have 5. 1, 2, that's 3, and move up. So if you've done only 4 rows, you'll have 4 clusters. If you've done these bigger, so you're always going to skip that first cluster. We're going to cluster our way up to this top peak. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to put to this point, and that'll give us our 5 clusters. So we'll end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Don't count that little one. Don't count that. So we're going to do a chain of 3. So it's 1 cluster, a chain of 3, and 1 cluster. 1, 2, 3. And put another cluster in. And work your way down, so that's 1 cluster there. That one's 2. So we've got 1 in this corner, 1 and 2. So that's 3 and 4. We're going to work our way down so we have 5 clusters. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 in here is 5. And 3. Now what we're going to do is we're going to keep that last stitch there, and we're going to take our next square. Now we're going to skip this first cluster. Make sure you've got it that way. We're going to skip that first cluster and go into this space. So put a yarn over, you've got 2 loops on your hook, and go into that space and pull through and do the first stitch. Now come through those 3 loops there. We're going to join these together. 1, 2 and 3 stitches. So we've got 3 stitches. Now the reason we're doing it like this is so that when we can stitch down here to join these, we don't have, if we just join it here, we'll have a great big space in there. We don't want a great big space. So we will be stitching these together. We'll stitch down just 3 stitches and we'll join it together once we've got them all done. So that's stitch 1. Now 1 into the next space. So that's stitch 2 into the next space. That's 3. 1 into the next space is 4. And into the top, 1 cluster, 3 chain and 1 cluster. So we'll do 1 cluster. We're going to put 3 chains in, 1, 2, 3, and I'm putting 3 in so that when we do these zigzag lines, you'll get a nice peak here, and it's really going to make this look as if you've got a big stack of granny squares all tucked underneath each other. So I've got a chain of 3 and put one more cluster in. And we're going to work down the way till I've got 5 clusters. So I've got 1 here, so that's number 1. And work down until we've got 5 going down the way. That's 1 and 2. 3. 4, and 1 into that last space is 5. Keep the last stitch on your hook of that group. So I've got 1, 2, 1 more to make that cluster. Keep that one on the hook and get your next square. So what we're going to do is we're going make sure it's the right way. It's going to go that way. We're going to skip that first one and work your first stitch in to that first space. So yarn over and work your first stitch in. Make sure it's a little bit tight, this first one, and then pull through those 3 loops. So that's my first stitch. Make your cluster in there and work up till we've got 5 clusters. So what you can see is this. Make sure they're not twisted. We'll sew them together soon. So you're going to do that and join the amount of squares that you have, however many you want. You're going to join them. You're going to go up, put a cluster, 3 chain in a cluster, then work down till you've got 5. So what you'll be doing each time, you skip that first cluster here and skip this cluster on this point. These are the 2 clusters you'll keep skipping, and at the beginning and end you'll skip that first cluster that's here and you'll be working in. So I'm going to continue up and down and join each of my squares. So I'll work up 1 cluster in each space. Now at the peak, you're going to put 1 cluster, a 3 chain, 3 chain, 1, 2, 3. Now when we done the squares, we only put 2 chains in the corners. But doing the zigzag, I'm going to put 3 and 1 more cluster. So that's cluster number 1, and we'll work down till we've got 5. And that one is number 5. So we're going to do the 3rd stitch and keep it on the hook. So keep it on the hook, and we're going to skip that one and bring our next cluster in. We're going to skip the first cluster and go into the space. So yarn over and into the space and build our cluster. So through 2 loops, yarn over and come through those 3 loops, and that's going to join those 2 together. Now you can, if you want, join, like I said, you can join your squares together first, but to avoid a great big hole in here, I'm doing it now, and then that way I know where I can start stitching up here and keep that hole relatively small. So I'm going to add all my squares, and I'll come back and I'll show you quickly how to just stitch these together, and then we'll continue row by row. I'm going to do each row a different colour. You can do all one colour if you want, it's up to you. This is the versatility of granny squares. You can use up all the scraps of yarn and scrap balls and half balls of yarn that you have. So I've joined my squares together, and I'm on the last cluster. Now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down this side. Now what I'm going to do, in to the first stitch in this chain, I'm going to put 2 UK treble crochets. That's 2 double crochets if you're in the USA. This is not a stitch. Now I'm going to hold off with these 2 stitches, and I'm going to cut my yarn. I'm going to do individual coloured rows. Now you can just use it to make up all your scrap pieces of yarn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just join my next colour in. Just wrap it around that tail end. We'll sew the tail ends in. And again, I'm going to do a chain of 2, 1, 2, and turn my work all the way around. We'll get these sewed together in a minute. And into that same space, that same stitch, I'm going to put 1 more treble crochet. That's a double crochet if you're in the USA. Just into that same stitch. This is just to make the edge. So remember, those 2 stitches is not part of the pattern. Don't count that. 1, 2, don't count that. So you're going to skip this cluster here and work in the next space. So skip those 2 stitches. That's not the pattern. Just ignore it. Skip that cluster and go in to the space and put your cluster in. So what those 2 stitches are going to do is they're going to make sure, it's going to make sure that the edge of your blanket goes straight up that way. So always ignore those 2 stitches at the beginning and at the end. Just ignore it. So this is your first cluster, skip it. So into that space and work your way up like you did with that other row. So before I get up and down, I'm going to just quickly show you stitching these corners together. Now I'm going to turn this around, make sure there's no twists in this. Now you can join these like I said before, but what I'm trying to do is to avoid a big space in here, and that's why I'm doing it just now. But you can do it right at the beginning if you want. Just make sure that you start from stitch 2 in this cluster. So just work your way up that stitch. But you can do this to begin with if you want. So in stitch 2 of that one, and through 1, 2, the second stitch of that one, and stitch right through and join them together. Now it's up to you if you do it now. That way you avoid a big space, like I've said. You avoid stitching them together in the wrong place. So if you've got like your first maybe 2 rows done, then you can just sew them. And that way, you know yourself, you're not going to have a great big space here. Just come through the front. And stitch it together. Take your yarn down the post of the stitch, hide it underneath that cluster. I'm sewing it in well. I don't want these to come out when it's getting washed. I want this to last a long time and not to come loose. And then take it out, and we're going to sew each of those squares together. A bit fussy, it's a little bit fussy doing it that way, but at least it makes sure that you don't end up with a great big space here doing it this way. So I'm going to sew my squares together and finish a few more rows off. Just remember that when you get to the end, when you work your way to the end, you'll put your last cluster in here, and then in this last stitch you'll put 2 stitches. You'll turn and you'll skip the 2 stitches and skip the first cluster and go into the space and have 1, 2, 3, 4, and one you make in there is 5. So I've finished this row, I've done my last cluster, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to skip this cluster and this space, and these are the 2 stitches on the end. So into the top of this last stitch I'm going to put 1 UK treble crochet and then another one, and these are double crochets if you're in the USA. I'm going to change my yarn again, so I'm going to leave 2 stitches on my hook to cut the yarn. I'm going to bring in my next one, and I keep saying you don't need to change the yarn. You can use any yarn you want for this, but you don't need to change the colours if you don't want to. It's a little bit more spectacular when you do. So I'm going to chain 2, 1 and 2, and turn. Bring all of this over to this side. So in that first, I've got my chain 2, and in that very first stitch I'll put 1 more. It's a UK treble crochet, a USA double. Now we're going to forget about it. We're going to skip the first cluster and go in to the next space. Skip that first full cluster and make your cluster in here. And once you sew your tail ends in, you're going to see that the edge of this blanket is going to go up, straight up that way, up like that. So I'm going to continue doing my colours, doing my zigzag up to the top, 1 cluster, 3 chain and 1 cluster, and then work my way down. So I'm going to do my last cluster down this side. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, this one's 5. Now I'm going to put my 3 stitches in, but keep that 3rd stitch on the hook. Put your yarn over, skip these 2 clusters and go into this space. And that's going to help pull your 2 stitches in, so you don't end up with a big gap. And you don't end up with a big chain here either, by doing that 3rd one and keep it on the hook and then start your next one. And work up and down, up and down, up and down. So I'm going to do that. Then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. And this is what we have. And doing a light colour around those squares really keeps the square focused in the blanket. And once you've done a few more rows, it'll look like you've got a big stack of squares, or it should do. It'll look as if you've got a big stack of squares all on top of each other. I'm going to make this much bigger because I'm going to do a lot more rows, and it's going to take me, I've got other projects on the go as well, so it's going to take me at least a week or two or something to get this up to the length that I want it. I'm going to use up all my odd balls, but when I've finished, people are going to say, what you're going to do with your edges. So because this one is done in white, I've kept a ball of white. What I'll do is, with the white, when I'm finished, I've got this blanket to the length I want it, I'm going to do USA single crochets, that's UK double crochets. I'm going to put 2 stitches into each row all the way up here. I'll put 2 in, and that in white, and that'll give me a beautiful border all the way up. I'll do 1 row in the granny stitch, up and down, just to finish off the peaks and the valley parts of this. I'll keep it in the zigzag, and when I get to this side, I've still got my pin in here because I'm still working on this. Again, I'll put 2 UK double crochets, that's USA single crochets. It's the same stitch, but it's just in the UK it's called something different rather than the USA. I'll put 2 into each row all the way down in white, even down here, down to here, and then I'll stop and cut my yarn off. If I want to do more rounds in the white, I could go around the whole outside of the blanket in the white with maybe 1 more row, all the way up the sides, all the way up here, and all the way down. And that's how you could finish this if you wanted to. It does have quite straight edges. The edges are quite straight, as you can see on it, but if you want to neaten it up, put 2 stitches, try 2 stitches in each row of a UK double crochet or USA single. You could put a treble crochet in if you want, or you could even in these spaces here, you could put a granny stitch in. You could sort of work from here and then put your granny cluster in, 1 in each row in these spaces up there if you want. You could still keep it on that granny stitch, that granny cluster up the sides. So if you know anyone, then subscribe to the channel. Spread my name around on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, and all those places. Share my videos. Any videos that you like, share them with your friends. Ask them to subscribe to the channel, and it's completely free. And there's a link down there. You just click on the subscribe button, and it'll tell you just a few steps how to subscribe to the channel. Help me get up to 1 million. Let me get one of the bigger channels and help me get that 1 million award. You don't get 1 million, you get a gold award to say you have 1 million subscribers. If you click on the bell icon, YouTube will tell you when I put up another tutorial. So until the next time, happy crafting, and I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.